herself as Harney's wife, now that she was the mother of his child. And compared to her sovereign right, Annabel Balch's claim seemed no more than a girl's sentimental fancy. That evening, at the gate of the Red House, she found Ally waiting in the dusk. "I was down at the post office just as they were closing up, and Will Target said there was a letter for you, so I brought it." Ally held out the letter, looking at Charity with piercing sympathy. Since the scene of the torn blouse, there had been a new and fearful admiration in the eyes she bent on her friend. Charity snatched the letter with a laugh. "Oh, thank you. Good night," she called out over her shoulder as she ran up the path. If she had lingered a moment, she knew she would have had Ally at her heels. She hurried upstairs and felt her way into her dark room. Her hands trembled as she groped for the matches and lit her candle, and the flap of the envelope was so closely stuck that she had to find her scissors and slit it open. At length she read: "Dear Charity, I have your letter, and it touches me more than I can say. Won't you trust me in return to do my best? There are things it is hard to explain, much less to justify, but your generosity makes everything easier. All I can do now is to thank you from my soul for understanding. Your telling me that you wanted me to do right has helped me beyond expression. If ever there is a hope of realizing what we dreamed of, you will see me back on the instant, and I haven't yet lost that hope." She read the letter with a rush, then she went over and over it, each time more slowly and painstakingly. It was so beautifully expressed that she found it almost as difficult to understand as the gentleman's explanation of the Bible pictures at Nettleton, but gradually she became aware that the gist of its meaning lay in the last few words: "If ever there is a hope of realizing what we dreamed of." But then he wasn't even sure of that? She understood now that every word and every reticence was an avowal of Annabel Balch's prior claim. It was true that he was engaged to her, and that he had not yet found a way of breaking his engagement. As she read the letter over, Charity understood what it must have cost him to write it. He was not trying to evade the importunate claim. He was honestly and contritely struggling between opposing duties. She did not even reproach him in her thoughts for having concealed from her that he was not free. She could not see anything more reprehensible in his conduct than in her own. From the first she had needed him more than he had wanted her, and the power that had swept them together had been as far beyond resistance as a great gale loosening the leaves of the forest. Only there stood between them, fixed and upright in the general upheaval, the indestructible figure of Annabel Balch. Face to face with his admission of the fact, she sat staring at the letter. A cold tremor ran over her, and the hard sobs struggled up into her throat and shook her from head to foot. For a while she was caught and tossed on great waves of anguish that left her hardly conscious of anything but the blind struggle against their assaults. Then, little by little, she began to relive, with a dreadful poignancy, each separate stage of her poor romance. Foolish things she had said came back to her, gay answers Harney had made, his first kiss in the darkness between the fireworks, their choosing the blue brooch together, the way he had teased her about the letters she had dropped in her flight from the evangelist. All these memories, and 1,000 others, hummed through her brain, till his nearness grew so vivid that she felt his fingers in her hair, and his warm breath on her cheek as he bent her head back like a flower. These things were hers. They had passed into her blood and become a part of her. They were building the child in her womb. It was impossible to tear asunder strands of life so interwoven. The conviction gradually strengthened her, and she began to form in her mind the first words of the letter she meant to write to Harney. She wanted to write it at once, and with feverish hands she began to rummage in her drawer for a sheet of letter paper. But there was none left. She must go downstairs to get it. She had a superstitious feeling that the letter must be written on the instant, that setting down her secret in words would bring her reassurance and safety. And taking up her candle, she went down to Mr. Royal's office. At that hour she was not likely to find him there. He had probably had his supper and walked over to Carrickfries. She pushed open the door of the unlit room, and the light of her lifted candle fell on his figure, seated in the darkness in his high-backed chair. His arms lay along the arms of the chair, and his head was bent a little. But he lifted it quickly as Charity entered. She started back as their eyes met, remembering that her own were red with weeping, and that her face was livid with the fatigue and emotion of her journey. But it was too late to escape, and she stood and looked at him in silence. He had risen from his chair and came toward her with outstretched hands. The gesture was so unexpected that she let him take her hands in his, and they stood thus without speaking, till Mr. Royal said gravely, "Charity, was you looking for me?" She freed herself abruptly and fell back. "Me? No." She set down the candle on his desk. "I wanted some letter paper, that's all." His face contracted, and the bushy brows jutted forward over his eyes. Without answering, he opened the drawer of the desk, took out a sheet of paper and an envelope, and pushed them toward her. "Do you want a stamp too?" he asked. She nodded, and he gave her the stamp. As he did so, she felt that he was looking at her intently, and she knew that the candlelight flickering up on her white face must be distorting her swollen features and exaggerating the dark rings about her eyes. She snatched up the paper, her reassurance dissolving under his pitiless gaze, in which she seemed to read the grim perception of her state, and the ironic recollection of the day when, in that very room, he had offered to compel Harney to marry her. His look seemed to say that he knew she had taken the paper to write to her lover, who had left her as he had warned her she would be left. She remembered the scorn with which she had turned from him that day, and knew, if he guessed the truth, what a list of old scores it must settle. She turned and fled upstairs, but when she got back to her room, all the words that had been waiting had vanished. If she could have gone to Harney, it would have been different. She would only have had to show herself, to let his memories speak for her. But she had no money left, and there was no one from whom she could have borrowed enough for such a journey. There was nothing to do but to write and await his reply. For a long time she sat bent above the blank page, but she found nothing to say that really expressed what she was feeling. Harney had written that she had made it easier for him, and she was glad it was so. She did not want to make things hard. She knew she had it in her power to do that. She held his fate in her hands. All she had to do was to tell him the truth, but that was the very fact that held her back. Her 5 minutes face to face with Mr. Royal had stripped her of her last illusion, and brought her back to North Dormer's point of view. Distinctly and pitilessly there rose before her the fate of the girl who was married to make things right. She had seen too many village love stories end in that way. Poor Rose Cole's miserable marriage was of the number, and what good had come of it for her or for Halston Skeff? They had hated each other from the day the minister married them, and whenever old Mrs. Skeff had a fancy to humiliate her daughter-in-law, she had only to say, "Who'd ever think the baby's only 2, and for a 7-month child? Ain't it a wonder what a size he is?" North Dormer had treasures of indulgence for brands and the burning, but only derision for those who succeeded in getting snatched from it, and Charity had always understood Julia Hawes's refusal to be snatched. Only, was there no alternative but Julia's? Her soul recoiled from the vision of the white-faced woman among the plush sofas and gilt frames. In the established order of things as she knew them, she saw no place for her individual adventure. She sat in her chair without undressing till faint grey streaks began to divide the black slates of the shutters. Then she stood up and pushed them open, letting in the light. The coming of a new day brought a sharper consciousness of ineluctable reality, and with it a sense of the need of action. She looked at herself in the glass, and saw her face, white in the autumn dawn, with pinched cheeks and dark-ringed eyes, and all the marks of her state that she herself would never have noticed, but that Dr. Merkel's diagnosis had made plain to her. She could not hope that those signs would escape the watchful village. Even before her figure lost its shape, she knew her face would betray her. Leaning from her window, she looked out on the dark and empty scene, the ashen houses with shuttered windows, the grey road climbing the slope to the hemlock belt above the cemetery, and the heavy mass of the mountain black against a rainy sky. To the east a space of light